Hi there, everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today is going to be a pretty different one-man review, as you could probably tell by the fact that my face is even on the screen. This is because this has to be a long conversation. I think this is probably the most important one-man review I did. It's probably the most important video I've ever recorded. And that's because this book that I'm going to be looking at, The Land of the Dead by Brian McDonald and Toby, Cypress, Lessons from the Underworld on Storytelling and Living, is the biggest gift of a book I've ever got. And it came at the exact right time. And I'll get more into that as I flip through the content of the book and expand upon it. But it really came at a moment when I've been, I don't want to say totally reevaluating, but I've been changing my opinions about a lot of things and then growing my opinions about a lot of things as well, based on all the conversations we've had on this channel and just things that are going on in the world. And this book really brought all those threads together for me and tied up really like the past 20 so years of my thoughts. And then also I think it opened up like the way forward for me, and hopefully in explaining what I've been thinking about, how I've been processing things, and then how this book helped me tie that all up and lead me a way forward. Hopefully that's inspirational for a lot of other people, and hopefully it's a helpful healing message for like whoever hears it. I'm very scared to make a video like this because there's a real risk of seeming egomaniacal or something like that. Like I feel like I have a revelation I got to share that's going to change the world. I don't mean it that way. I just mean it in the sense that everything I've learned about the channel has taught me, like 3 hours ago while reading this book, finally given me the keys to opening up things that I think are going to be super helpful for me moving forward. And I want to share that because hopefully if it's revelatory to me, it's revelatory to someone else as well. And I don't mean revelation in the sense of like God beamed an idea down in my head, and I'll actually cover that more when we talk about the book. I want to start by saying one of the things that's happened in the last couple days, yesterday actually, is there was this article put out by the Times UK, I forget the guy's name, but it's basically an attack not just on creatives. He's saying that AI is taking creatives from their pedestal of prestige and knocking them down to where they need to be. But within that, he has embedded a extremely toxic and cancerous just attack on creativity itself. I don't mind the idea that some creatives, or just the illusion of creativity, is something that people use as a barrier to like the less educated, or that there's something snobby behind it. I don't mind that criticism at all. I think it's true. I think a lot of people that come out of NFA programs need to get their head out of their own ass and speak more plainly and that kind of thing. But I want to pull out this one paragraph here where the writer says, "Our exaggerated reverence for the creative impulse," not just creative people, the creative impulse, "derives from the romantics of the early 19th century. The twilight of religion required new justifications for the cosmic specialness of humans. If we are not made in God's image, what is it about us that is divine? The answer was that the artist's creation of sublime paintings or poetry put him in touch with the numinous." Versions of this idea can be found everywhere from Coleridge to Schopenhauer. This belief in the spiritual superiority of artists filtered through from intellectual bohemia to the upper middle classes, and by the mid-20th century, social prestige practically required at least an attempted aura of artiness. I think that last thing is total crap. I don't know. Most people, when I tell them I'm an artist, they're like, "Oh, great for you. You're like really contributing to the world. Thanks, buddy." So I think that is, this is obviously someone who's lived in a very like tight social bubble, it seems like, and hasn't been out in the world a lot. That's my sense. But whatever, you just have a limited view of what's actually going on. That's not that big of a deal. The real problem here is the attack on the creative impulse. And he goes on later in the article to talk about this idea that, well, if no one had to work, like, the idea is that everyone would just go be creative and write their masterpiece. And that's obviously bullshit. Like, not everyone is that creative, and they shouldn't be looked down upon for having that resource. And he's saying, AI is behind this. And I find that extremely troubling. I predicted this mentality in our conversation with Dave McKean 5 months ago, that the AI is going to psychologically decenter humanity, potentially, if we look at it in the wrong way, from that place of specialness, of creativity, and undervalue what is really special about our creative impulse. So I find that extremely dangerous for a number of reasons. The first one I want to say right up front, and the other one I'll get to as we go through the book. The first one I'll say right up front is I disagree. Just because everyone's not going to write the classic novel or not an artist or whatever doesn't mean that they aren't creative creatures involved in meaning-making activities, and that those meaning-making activities are the most essential thing to all of our lives, especially the personal, not the public. The public we'll get into in the book, and it's obviously important as well. But what I'm talking about is you may not go write the great novel. You may not have those ideas, and that doesn't make you less important. So maybe what this guy needs to be saying is that we need to revalue smaller acts of creation, not devalue the big acts. We need to continue to value those very highly, but we need to revalue the small creative acts. He's missing the fact that if a grandfather had a rock and he went on a special journey with that rock, and that rock like meant a special something to him, and he passed it on to his kid, and then that father passed it on to the grandson, that is a creative act that is very small, and every human being does that. We all attach meaning to something in our lives, whether it be the people around us, objects, whatever. We're all creative in that way. We're all meaning makers, and that's an essential component to keeping us healthy as a species. If we don't have that, we're committing, what he is talking about is committing psychological species-wide suicide. If you devalue the reverence for the creative impulse, you are committing species-wide suicide. Now, AI is going to put that to the test, because AI is already, this is why this guy is even having this thought, is because AI now is something else that is creating meaning. And I don't believe these people who think, well, it's just photo bashing and stuff. That's not what it's doing. It passes the Turing test for creativity. If you put out a number of AI things and a number of human-made things, and just a general audience had to pick between them, most people wouldn't be able to know, and most people would be able to derive some type of meaning from the AI-generated content. So it is inherently now a meaning-making force in our world, which decenters us from that. We're not the only unique special thing. The writer's correct about that. But that doesn't mean that our ability to do so isn't special. We're just sharing it with something else now, and we can't get rid of that. So that's the first thing I want to say that's been coming to a head for me. And then this book comes at the perfect point, because it's all about the reevaluation of narrative and narrative meaning, the public collective meaning. So the valuing these massive pieces of art that should be celebrated because of what they tell us about ourselves. So Brian McDonald is a scriptwriter in Hollywood. He's also someone who's obviously studied story quite a bit. He's, analyzed all these movies. He's familiar with Jungian analysis. He's obviously read Campbell, and he's bringing all these things together in a really, really special way in this book. And then that's bolstered by, and I'm not going to spend too much time, just flipping through the book. I think it's an essential book that you should all go read, and I don't want to spoil too much of their narrative flow and stuff, but I do want to show you, just the astonishing art. I've always been a fan of Toby Cypress. I always feel like I've never enjoyed the stories from the books that he's worked on, and finally I get to see him at his full artistic powers with content that I'm really, really excited about. Just gorgeous art that, has a real kind of Sergio Topi vibe to the design, and the crazy mark making, the spontaneous mark making. It's just so beautiful. And then a lot of the type of screen printing tricks that me and Sean have been playing with, he's obviously already mastered them, as putting them to use in this book. So visually as compelling as it can be. And then, what Brian McDonald does in terms of going back to archetypal storytelling is really, really important. I'm totally, definitely aware of the work of Jordan Peterson. I was exposed to his work in 2016 because a lot of the just comments I was making anti-postmodernism at that time, and I know that's a blanket word that I'm using incorrectly, but that's how he was presenting it. I was pushing back against some of the same philosophical viewpoints he was, and people exposed me to the work. What I found really meaningful about his work was his Maps of Meaning lecture series, which is pretty much the same thing as this book. So that's the first thing that I want to point out, and tie it to a personal experience I had recently to explain why I've been thinking about these things. I've been struggling a lot lately with the idea of growing up, and that extended. I had kind of a minor mental breakdown during Christmas break because of just all of the stresses of my life and Tori having long COVID and that kind of stuff. And leading up to Christmas break, I was really struggling with growing up, like becoming a caretaker for somebody means really growing up and learning not to be selfish. And I'm, as an artist, an extremely selfish creature. And so that's been really hard. And in all of that irritation, I went to my first graduation ceremony for the Shelton State Community College, which is where I teach full time. I hadn't had a regalia before, so I couldn't go do that, be involved in the ceremony of it. I've sat like in the bleachers, but I've never had to wear regalia before. And as someone who's probably autistic, definitely misophonic, and definitely really sensitive to sensation, I'm wearing this robe. I'm hot as hell. I've got this cap on my head and this little tassel every time I move banging me. And it was just, I'm near mental breakdown coming like a week later, and just too much stimulation. And so I was in the worst mood. And I went into this graduation ceremony, and all I could see was like my hatred for the human species for being so childish, because I looked at it and I saw this is what children do. They dress up and they tell stories, and they can't just tell it like it is. You have to have it presented in a story for it to make sense. And there's something that struck me at the time as so childish about that. So for about a week or two, I was on this kick of like, well, we need to grow up as a species. And then I was like, okay, well, what do I mean by growing up? Well, I mean like being able to just accept something told as just straight up without any kind of dressing and pomp and circumstance over it. And then it was like, well, that's obviously the scientific worldview, and there's obviously taken to the extreme, the scientific worldview has caused problems. I'm not trying to diminish science. It's just that it can't be the only methodology. That's obvious. And we've done away with story as we're trying to grow up, but we're kind of in this awkward, maybe like early teen stage where now we think we know everything and we're running about being really clever, but we're not listening to the advice of the elders, which is the story. And that's what this book argues for. And I really struggled with that, and this book helped me resolve it a little bit. But also I realized, oh no, what you need obviously is the two in conjunction. Is you need that childish aspect that's presented through story. That's the type of creature we are, and that's what this book is arguing, and that's also what I really value about Jordan Peterson's work. I don't really care about what he's doing publicly now because he's gotten involved in debates I think people should just stay out of, but or at least too surface level with his dealings in them. So, but what I do think is correct in that and in this book as well is this trying to create a relationship between narrative and science that leads to what I think is faith. And I don't mean that in the religious sense. I finally just came to understand what faith really means for me, is that when we're looking at stories, we know they're not true in the scientific sense, and Jordan Peterson makes that point plenty. But we can choose, like I can choose personally to go do a little something in my backyard that I know like isn't, like, I'm not a magician, I'm not doing magic, but I'm creating meaning for myself, and I have faith in that meaning generating activity, whether I think there's any causal kind of scientific explanation behind it, or even a non-scientific causal magical explanation or whatever. It's just the fact that I have faith in the importance of what I'm doing. And so I think there's going to be, or hopefully is starting to be, a merging of story and science where they can coexist. And what people like Brian McDonald and Jordan Peterson are doing that I think is so important is they're creating fables out of our mythology. So the structure of a fable is you tell the story in the story terms for the child, and then at the end you attach the adult, like, clear explanation. So don't lie. That's like the story of the boy who cried wolf. You need to tell the story to make it land emotionally because we're emotional creatures. So it's a rhetorical device. But then at the end, if you really, really want to pound that home, then you do give a more straightforward explanation. So what this author is doing, what Brian McDonald's doing, and what Jordan Peterson did that I valued, was tying scientific, psychological, neurological knowledge to the stories. So fableizing our mythology, and I think that's really important. And explaining it from the adult standpoint of like, this is what it was actually about. And I think that's what makes this book so powerful. And McDonald does it in a way that doesn't touch on any of the hot button political issues that I think undermine the value in what Peterson's doing, which is why this is such an important blessing of a book for me personally. So some other things that come out of this, and I'm going to be flipping through the book because McDonald obviously has the meta narrative that he's telling, story about stories, and he presents it in a very linear story fashion, so it's extremely readable and all links together and builds up to an emotional landing point where he does ground it in real world stories at the end, real world stories of death. That's another thing I've experienced. I've understood some of these things intellectually, but until I had to become a caretaker and had the emotional impact in my own life, they don't land fully. And so he's also willing to say, like, look, we got to have real life stories to make these really emotionally land. But I'm going to jump around through the book to try and create my own narrative of this book, plus a comment that Alexis Deacon made in the interview we did the day that I got this book. That's why I say it came at the right time. Alexis made a comment about linear progress versus expansional progress, like a tree, and that unlocked the key. So I'm going to try and go through this book in a way that builds towards what I feel like is a revelation, and again, not piped in from outside, but just like my brain finally put together all the pieces that I've been collecting. So I'm going to jump around in the book a little bit. The first thing that I really appreciate about this book, and I think is going to be necessary for our society, is it's extremely multicultural. And it's delving into the myths of all the different cultures and trying to find the common juice behind them. It's trying to essentialize the juice out of them. There's pushback against this, and I've heard it from a number of my students that when they're going into especially cultural anthropology and sociology classes, that they're being taught a different methodology, which is fine. The other methodology that they're being taught is that we shouldn't take this essentialized version of compressing the juice out of our mythology to find what's common, that's like a lie to ourselves. And this is a fair criticism, that we're trying to say that we're looking at all this stuff objectively, but really we're looking at it from our Western worldview. And so we're only squeezing the juice that we expect out of it. That's fair criticism. And so as a methodology, yeah, that's great. You're going to want to try and understand each culture from within itself. But when you say that's the only methodology, and they do that, because I've had students come to me in various situations and talk about I got a student who was asked to write a paper explaining how he could view from inside the other culture that it was okay for the young men to have to perform oral sex and swallow the semen of the elders to become men. Like, you have to consume a man to become a man. And he just, I couldn't agree with that, like, no matter how hard I tried. And he said the teacher gave it back to me and said I had a really well written essay, but I didn't do the assignment because I came away saying I couldn't agree with that. And so he got a B on it. So that's the kind of insistence on it that's a little, that's sketchy to me. The methodology itself isn't sketchy, but the insistence that it's the only methodology is problematic. There's a lot of value to be had in a methodology that also tries to find the commonalities between everybody. When you're looking at things from inside each culture, there's going to inherently be some divisiveness in this because different cultures do have different cultural values. But I'm looking at the human species as a species, and we do want to find out what's collective between us. Now, that may need contributions from multiple cultures to get to it, but that's kind of what a book like this is doing. It's saying that's what these stories are. These are the contributions from the multiple cultures, and maybe we do need to get inside of the cultures a little bit to really find it, but ultimately, I think it's just wrong. It's so dangerous to push aside that search for the commonalities between us. So I very much appreciate that Brian McDonald is risking in the current environment something that takes on that what would now often be called like colonializing other people's stories. I think that's a problematic view We see a lot of like decolonialized education and all of that. And there's, again, very obvious real reasons why people have that viewpoint, but to the extent that it pushes away what draws us together, I find it very dangerous. So good for him. I really appreciate that. Now I'm going to jump around to some more fine-tuned points of things that I like, and then hopefully build up to like my final conclusion in some kind of logical way. This is definitely going to be a longer review. I like here at the end, I'm going to jump to the end, but responding to this author still, if you were a storyteller, maybe now you have a sense of your immense responsibility. Use this wisdom well in your craft, and do not take your task lightly, for you're teaching people not only to survive, but how to live. And that's the ethic that's driving this book, and I think that's the ethic that drives me as a storyteller, and it's the ethic that's driving my urge to unpack a little bit more than what's in this book. I think this book misses a couple of things, or at least this book is a really good summary of all of the interpretation of story till now. And I think there's a couple of things that through engaging in the channel, these are the revelations of like, oh, we could reinterpret those things in an even deeper way and find more meaning in them. So I think that ethic is driving my motivation for this video, and it obviously drove Brian McDonald, and it's a great ethic to operate on. So going from there, I want to jump back to earlier in the book, and this is kind of, I'm going to extrapolate out of this a bit, but I want to talk a little bit about the dangers of not taking that ethic seriously or distorting that ethic. So anyone who's read The Strange Death of Alex Raymond is probably aware of, well, should be aware of the fact that since 2018, during working on Strange Death of Alex Raymond, I have formed a strange relationship with the deity Circe, the story of Circe, and it showed up for me in The Strange Death of Alex Raymond, and I've seen it everywhere since, and especially in 2018 also, right at the time I was kind of encountering in Strange Death. Madeline Miller wrote a book called Circe that was a expansion, not an inversion. I would say she was expanding the story of Circe and growing it. So I actually didn't, the book wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I didn't hate it the way I thought it was going to be, but I just found it kind of boring, honestly. But most other people are really enjoying that book. So Circe's been in my mind, and I've been trying to figure out what Circe represents metaphorically, and this book clarifies it for me. I was making the mistake of thinking that Circe was like the entity that would try and tempt you into inverting things, or tempt you into expediency. And this book actually ties it to the idea of expediency and childishness directly, but flip my meaning a little bit on that. So he ties it to like the land of toys and Pinocchio that turns everyone into asses. And Circe, obviously, Odysseus takes his men there in the Odyssey, and they're being expedient. They're looking for a place to rest, a place to go get drink and eat. And because of that kind of piggish, donkeyish behavior, she turns them into beasts. So I'm realizing now that Circe is actually just the metaphorical representation of the consequences of expediency. And tying that to two different things was really this book. Like a couple hours ago when I read it, boom, these things resolved in my mind, where Circe, also the toy can represent technology, so expedience through technology. And that's covered in The Abolition of Man. That's the reason I chose the C.S. Lewis essay to run through the AI, is because that's very much about humankind's urge to use technology to conquer nature, especially for the sake of making things easier, and that the end result of that process will actually be the abolition of man, that nature will win in the end. So I think Circe is a representative of that. You can think of the toys in that way. Obviously, I'm not anti-technology. I'm here talking to you on YouTube. But I do think technology for the sake of expediency, or seen as a toy, is a problem. The other type of expediency that Circe now represents to me, as of a couple hours ago, was the one that I was more tying it to in Strange Death of Alex Raymond, because of Dave's insistence on Ward Green doing magic using the Rip Kirby strip as an act of inversionism. And what Dave means by inversionism, I think, can be expanded on here as an instance of childish expediency. So What Dave means by inversionism is that if you take a story that has a deep metaphorical like meaning and you flip that on its head and make it mean the opposite thing. And I'm having to be really careful about that. Actually, I recorded this whole video once, and this is how important I think this is. Recorded it once, and it didn't, like, I got the audio, but not the video. And I was like, an hour in, but I got to re-record this because it's so important. So I could have taken the expedient way out there, too. But I struggled in the first recording, and then the 10 minutes I went to go eat, I separated out what I want to call expansionist literature and inversionist literature. So inversionism would flip the story and make it mean the opposite thing. And I think the way that you could identify an inversionist story is it's usually like a taste of your own medicine vibe behind it. And the best example, and the first time I ever really became aware of that, was the movie Maleficent, where they just took the story of, Snow White and or Cinderella or whatever, and they just flipped it around with like a taste of your own medicine, let's tell you how bad men are type of thing. An expansionist story could flip the meaning of something, and I'm going to do that a couple times in this book. But I think in an expansionism, you can tell it because it's not a taste of your own medicine. It's trying to dig further in or unfold the story more and find like, hey, we've been telling these stories all the time. We really want to know the value in the story. And I'm suggesting at certain points that we've interpreted it wrong and there's a healthier interpretation for it. So I see that inversionist strategy as also expedient and childish because it's a taste of your own medicine, which is always an expedient strategy to try and get someone to correct their behavior. And it's never going to work because you're just going to make them angry. And we see that play out in our society all the time now. There's a lot of expediency in terms of taste of your own medicine, and it's just causing more division instead of more cohesion between us. So that's childish to me. That's people playing Calvin ball from Calvin and Hobbes, where the rules can change with every move so that you always win. And that's childish expediency. And that's the inversionist. And I think Cersei, for me now, represents the consequence of expediency, whether in the toys or whether in stories or whatever. So I got that from reading this book combined with everything that we've been thinking about. This is the kind of powerful book this is. Another point that I found really, really powerful in this book is he goes into a section about what angels represent. And the most powerful kind of quote from there is, angels don't fix problems, they fix attitudes. And on the next page, Brian McDonald expands upon that and says that why wouldn't we want people to come in and just fix things for us? And he said, well, narratively, when they do that, that's always the narrative device of the Deus ex machina. And those are never satisfying stories because it's just like something comes in externally and just fixes all your problems for you. And there's something deeply unsatisfying about that. And this is something I've been grappling with quite a bit. It's another type of narrative expediency that I've been seeing a lot lately that's really been bothering me. And this is where I think our storytellers aren't taking that responsibility that they have as seriously as they could be. And that's all of this multiverse storytelling. Sean and I did a collaboration that used the AI as the starting point, and then we drew on top of it. And then I wrote a little, it's just 3 pages, so it's not an essay, but I wrote a little commentary about my distaste for multiversal storytelling. And this kind of unlocks even more for me why that is. The problem with the multiverse storytelling is, first off, it's just a bad idea about what reality is. It's illogical and makes no sense. I'm not a physicist. I don't care what they tell you. It's illogical. We'll eventually move past that, I promise. But the other problem is it's morally corrupt storytelling because of the expediency. And what I mean by that is in a multiverse of infinite possible realities, you kind of get a pass on moral actions. You kind of can inevitably just, I could jump to another universe where I didn't make that mistake and replay it over again. And that's the Deus ex machina for moral responsibility. Like, I can just jump and fix the problem. And that seems so unhealthy to me, because what it does is it kind of shifts the burden of, like, if there's only one reality, it's much more important to get it right here. Not like, oh, I could fuck up and get it right somewhere else. Like, we need to get it right here. And so we need storytelling that reinforces the importance of the now, the here, I actually think that's the message of it is a multiverse story, but everything everywhere all at once. And I've had a ton of students coming to me, tell me, you got to watch this movie, you got to watch this movie. There was some core truth in there that they love. And when I watched it, I said, oh, this is actually a condemnation of multiversal storytelling, because what it is, and we'll talk about this more later, is it's a relationship between a mother and a daughter that's gone awry, and they're jumping around the universe trying to fix it. And then at the end, they have to say, we just got to fix it here. Fuck all that multiverse. Fuck all those alternate lives. We gotta fix it here. And we gotta put past the philosophical differences between generations and things like that. And that's embedded in what I'm going to talk about as well later on. We got to put past that and focus on our relationship here and now. So I value that movie very much, and the message it's putting out there, and I'm really, really happy and hopeful that my students are responding so positively to it and really enjoy it. And I've seen a lot of movies about like forgiveness and healing lately, which give me a lot of hope for where we're headed versus the previous 10 years of movie making, which has been a lot of inversionist, taste of your own medicine, crazy multiverse, just getting rid of responsibility. So this book again really helped me with this idea of why it's the Deus ex machina, and it's not satisfying. There's another type of story that he talks about in here that I would like to expand upon. It's going to sound like an inversion, but again, I think the inversion comes with a taste of your own medicine. So there's here he talks about the story of the werewolf, basically the rational man containing the animal inside, whether that be the werewolf or some Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or something like that. Behind those stories is always the metaphor is that there's like our selfish, awful, cannibalistic lizard brain, animal brain inside of us that we have to control with our rational human mind. And that metaphor has never struck me as right. The first time I remember thinking this is in 2013. I was living with someone who had a husky, and I know it's not a wolf, it's not a wild animal, but it has a lineage. And then in 2018, I spent about a year hanging out with an American Indian dog, which is like half dog, half coyote, so these half wild animals. And those are like the sweetest animals. And I have 2 Labradors. They're like the sweetest animals out there. See, this is crazy. Like if a person turned into a wolf, they wouldn't go on a murdering rampage. Like why we got this story so wrong? Like my dogs have killed a squirrel, but they're not like trying to torture the squirrel or anything like that. It's just their instinct as hunters. They're Labradors. It's only humans who can torture someone else, who could rape somebody, who could be a Nazi and like gas Jews in a concentration camp. It's us that's the monster. It's not the animals that's the monster. So it does sound like I'm inverting the story, but what I'm trying to do is like peel back the layer more and see where we got it wrong. And I think what we got it wrong, why we've gotten that story wrong, is because who wants to admit that to themselves? Like humanity as a whole doesn't want to admit it to themselves. So it's easy to package up. I think this story is like a kind of subconscious inversion on our part from the get-go that needs to be tweaked back to reality, is that like the better story to tell, and I've wanted to tell this for a while, is someone's beautiful little dachshund who's the sweetest dog once a month turns into a human and turns into a serial killer. That seems to map onto reality much better to me. So there's something about this where I think Brian McDonald is throughout representing the kind of standard Jungian and Joseph Campbell interpretations of story. And I think we've got that wrong. And I think as a species, we'd be better off admitting to ourselves that we're the dangerous ones. This is something I think Jordan Peterson got quite right, is he talks about the interpretation of good and evil. Like why did eating the fruit and becoming self-aware make us good and evil? And it's like, well, in self-awareness, you can understand what would hurt you, and then you're capable of hurting someone else. Animals don't have that. Animals can't plan to hurt someone. They might hurt something instinctively, but it's not the evil that is in mankind. And so I think that's very powerful, and I think we need to reassess this myth. And then we kind of get a hint of that from Brian McDonald, not quite, where he's going into Gulliver's Travels, and he's talking about the Yahoos, and this is actually where the word Yahoo came from. And so it's interesting to me that we've now connected Yahoo as like the early internet search and like the earliest kind of big internet portal that most of us experienced, tying that to inversionism and expediency and all of those things. I mean, he doesn't make that explicit, but I would like to, because that's what I'm trying to do is take these stories and make them more explicit. That's the project I think we need to engage in. So he says that the Yahoos are basically humans who have devolved back into animals. And then on the next page, he goes into what I think is a much healthier view, is the self-criticism of humanity that he pulls out of Planet of the Apes, where at the end of the movie, you realize that the apes are so distressed by humans because they know that the humans are the destructive force. They're the ones that have got it wrong. So it's actually the self-conscious, rational human animal that's not as in control of itself as it thinks. And it's not controlling your animal part. It's controlling where the rational part goes wrong with the kind of animalistic care for your environment and for other things like that. That is probably the route that we need to go in. And so I do like that he touches on that. But I think overall he kind of accepts the older interpretation, and I would suggest that we all rethink that. So all of that is building up. Those are things that I've been thinking about for a long time, things that I've been toying with, things that I could have expressed fairly clearly before this, but this book helped crystallize them for me. The reason I call this book a gift is because the day I got the book, we had just recorded our Shuna's Journey analysis with our guest Alexis Deacon. And during that video, Alexis said something about the idea of progress. I forget exactly what context, if it was talking about personal identity or just history, storytelling, or something like that. But he pointed out that most people take progress, and I've always done this, and I've used C.S. Lewis's argument about progress many, many times, where he says, like, the most progressive man is the one who gets to their location, that their desired location, the fastest, which I still think is really wise. It's like if you're trying to get to Canada and you're driving to Mexico, turning around is a good idea. It's not always a bad idea to go backwards. But there is built into that linear idea of forwards and backwards a real valid worry about returning to the awful things from the past. So a lot of times, if you're saying you're conservative, or even like people say regressive, it's seen as going backwards to like we've forgotten the progress that we want to make by doing that. And I've kind of always accepted that view and accepted that. And Alexis, he didn't even seem to understand what a pearl of wisdom he dropped. But he said there's another way to think about, I think he was talking about personal identity, but that you can grow. There's a progression, like in it. He said a tree, and a tree like has the core, and it grows out and it adds to itself. And that, it was just such a flippant comment to at the time for him, I think, but to me I almost started weeping because it was so revelatory. And that combined with what's said in this book to what and all the conversations we've had over the last couple years on the channel, all the stuff talking about AI, talking to Dave McKean, talking to Luciano Floridi, who I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, talking to Alexis, all the comments that people have made. When I'm saying revelation, again, I want to stress that this is just a realization that I've come to through all of that feedback. And one of the reasons I'm doing this video is to share that, because I think anyone who's been involved in the channel is a co-author of that. And also because I've always operated the reverse of Socrates. Socrates engaged in what was called elenchus, and that's just the Socratic method of questioning people to the point where you find kind of a conflict within their beliefs, and then you press on that. I've always thought that that's kind of expedient, childish behavior, and he was seen as a gadfly for it. I always thought that the braver thing to do would be to state yourself as clearly as possible and put yourself out for the criticism to come back to you, so you can reevaluate your own viewpoints. And that's part of what I'm trying to do with this video too, is I feel like I've tied up a whole bunch of things and I'm trying to grow into something new, and I'm going to need that feedback. So that's why I'm doing such a lengthy video here. But that idea of the tree, I'm going to go into much deeper, but also this bit in the book here, I think this is a thought that's new to me, at least. I don't know. Maybe I have heard it somewhere else and I'm just forgetting it. But I had what I think is a revelation, and by that I just mean all these threads coming together, where he's talking about the symbol of the snake. And he says, in The Power of Myth, comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell said, the snake is the symbol of life throwing off the past and continuing to live. The serpent that stole the flower from Gilgamesh also sheds its skin, throwing off the past, so to speak. This is what Gilgamesh needs to learn. And then he ties that to enjoying life rather than death. And that just slapped me across the face as I was reading it as incorrect. And then I tied that to this idea of the tree that Alexis introduced like just 2 days ago. And I think that there is a deeper unfolding of the symbolism of the snake that can be done, and it's in relation to the symbol of the tree. And I was this is my only criticism of the book, is on the cover here, the main icon is the tree. And there's this beautiful page right here as well that is the tree. And when I look at this page, and as I go into it further, the idea of this blind character with this book of knowledge and everything in front of the tree, not seeing the tree, seems so potent to me that I think Brian McDonald and Toby Cypress were telling themselves they were missing something, because this book never, ever, ever, there's almost a tree on every page. This crows and trees on every page. To me, it's the more central symbol even than the crow, the tree of life, and it's not covered. It's the one thing that's not unpacked in this book. So I want to delve into that, because this is what all of these conversations, my entire last 20 years of my life, but especially these last 2 years, have crystallized for me as of 4 hours ago. So I'm going to get some things wrong in my trying to unpack this metaphor, but the tree is, that's the right way to view growth, and it's the map of the world. It's the map of everything, and I think that's why it shows up as the tree of life, the tree that connects everything in mythology. And what I realized is that the reason that the snake is sin is the snake represents the linear viewpoint, right? That you go, you shed your skin, you become the new thing, you shed your skin, you become the new thing, you shed your skin. I mean, I know that's just the snake growing, but we kind of reinterpret that as like you shed your old self and become the new self, and it gets rid of the idea of any kind of persistence of self through time, rather than the tree, which is there is a seed, and that seed grows up, and there's a core, and the core remains healthy all the way through the tree, the life of the tree. It's only when the core becomes rotten that the tree dies, right? Like that's the last thing you want, is a rotten core of your tree. And so that's maybe the deepest sin that we can have. And by sin, I don't mean God's going to judge you on it. I just mean missing the mark, which is I believe the interpretation of sin. I grew up Christian religious, but not at all religious anymore. And that my explanation of why is actually tied to my understanding of the tree now. So I mean that in that sense, that we're missing the mark, and we've been missing the mark with this linear view of growth. And maybe that's only a consequence of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment era. Maybe that's the greatest sin of the Enlightenment era, is that language put on a page. And I got this from Marshall McLuhan, which his Understanding Media is a really great book, that forces linearity. And now we're moving back into an audiovisual culture, which is inherently less locked down and linear. I think that's part of the battle going on in society right now, is those two things rubbing up against each other. And the tree's a great representation. I'll get to that in a second as well. But maybe that's the sin, and maybe that's the way that we need to interpret the snake, is that the snake is a misinterpretation of a tree shedding its branches. So it's not that as we go we have to totally reinvent ourselves and totally shed our skin. It's that we have a healthy core that is the collective wisdom of humanity that's told in our stories. And we've been undervaluing that. And we've been undervaluing that because we've been mistaking the need to get rid of rotten branches with the need to shed the skin and become something entirely new, rather than something that continues to grow and make itself stronger from the core out, and you just shed the improper branches. Like, I don't think the Enlightenment era Western project that now is under attack is a bad core. I think it's a great core. It just had some really shitty branches and interpretations of that, like slavery and all the systemic things that people are rightly pointing out. Those are branches that need to be trimmed, but the attack tends to be on the core of the project, and the core of this kind of globalized interpretations of things gets mixed up with colonialization. And I think this is a healthy core, and that other stuff are branches that need to be trimmed. But because we've mistaken the snake in the tree for a branch falling off, we've been taking that wrong linear progression. And I've seen this instantiating itself in everything that bugs me. The first thing that I want to point out is through working with students and just paying attention to the world in general, it's very obvious to me that we have an unhealthy view of personal identity that's based around the snake. That there is no such thing as a core identity. That everyone's the tabula rasa, the blank slate, and that society forms you, and then you kind of have this ever-present burden to be defining yourselves at all moments and constantly shedding your skin. And like that identity is something that you always have to be working on in like a transformation, always constant transformation, instead of like there's a core and I'm trying to refine and grow and strengthen and perfect the core and get rid of the bits and pieces. Like, I've been changing my mind about things on the channel as we go. There's still a core me behind all that that's the type of person who wants to do that. I also think the idea of the blank slate is bullshit. Like, you go to any chalkboard and there's micro variations in the surface that each chalkboard, if you put a line on it, in the same spot, it would have a different character. And as you build chalk on top of it, which is the societal things glomming on top of you, those are going to stick to the board. The chalk is going to stick and pile up on different boards in different ways. So we need to get past this idea of the tabula rasa. That's terrible. And when you think you're a blank slate that's constantly kind of tied to needing to reinvent yourself at every moment, that leaves people, I'm just, it's wrecking people's lives. And I see that firsthand every day. That's all that they can think about is how to define themselves within the world, and they can't exist in the world comfortably. And I'm not trying to dip into any kind of identity politics or anything like that there. I think I'm trying to go deeper than that. I have a deeper problem. I don't care about any of the surface level stances, political stances people have. I just think we have a rotten idea of the snake as a model for identity rather than the tree. And we need to go back to the tree. And of course, trees need to be pruned and managed and things like that. I'm not saying that the core identity doesn't grow and evolve, but it's not constantly sloughed off and becoming something entirely new. Another thing I think that the tree points out is the idea of linearity versus nonlinearity that I was talking about in Marshall McLuhan. Linearity locked us in a little bit, but I think the idea of nonlinearity, or even the term nonlinearity, I've always had a problem with that. And the tree, it kind of is a good example of why. Like when someone says nonlinear, like the best example I could think of would be like free association, where I'd say blue, and then, I don't know, Superman wears blue, and then I drank Superman shots was the only kind of alcohol I've ever liked. But I also think of Blue's Clues and the blues and maybe depression, and it just that. And but the problem of calling that totally nonlinear is there's the jump from each one to the next is a logical kind of jump, like blue, Superman has blue, there's a dog named Blue Clues, blues, we talk about the blues, and I can go through that. And so I call it loosely linear. I think that's a better way to say than nonlinear. And a tree is like that, right? grows up and it branches and it branches and it branches. And in the end, you don't get a straight line, you don't get the snake, but you do get a loosely linear network of things where at each point there was some good reason for the branching off to the next point. I think what loose linearity suggests is that there's no point, there's no purpose, anything could go any which way at any which time, and that's kind of the universal Deus ex machina of the multiverse too. There's not an infinite amount of universes branching out infinitely. There is one reality and one society and one people growing together, and we're making logical, or what we think is reasonable, points at each turn, and that could make a loosely linear network of growth. So I think that's a really valuable way that the tree gave me the metaphor. I've used that term loosely linear since 2005 or 6 when I got assigned Marshall McLuhan and Ann Wagner's art history class at UC Berkeley. So, like I'm saying, this is tying together 20 years of things I've been thinking about. That's how powerful this book by Brian McDonald is it's giving me this kind of surface to interpret from and grow from myself. I think also the tree is a really good representation for me of why a religious worldview is, and I know here I'm talking about story, and I know that in my opinion the right way to think about these things is as very, very powerful stories that we can learn lessons from. But literally, no, I don't believe in a God. I think that's a foolish idea. I think it's backwards. The idea of a God is that to make something complex, like if I'm going to make a watch, then we need a human to make it, because like the tornado doesn't just blow through the junkyard and make a watch. But that has a broken assumption in it that complexity needs more complexity to create it, and then God is just positing if the universe is this complex, then it needs a creator. Well, then you're supposing a creator that's obviously like me to the watch. I'm infinitely more complex than the watch. So if you're trying to explain complexity through more complexity, it's an infinite regress of then what made God? So the proper way is to think about growing up from the bottom. I think our society has a very top-down, whether it be in institutions, like in a hierarchical sense, or just religious views or whatever. It's very top-down. The fact of the matter is that the only thing that makes any logical sense, I don't care what any physicist or whatever tells you, if they're not saying this, they got it wrong. They'll be proven wrong over time, is that complexity grows out of simplicity. And I think that goes all the way down to just off or on. Quantum binary, is it there or not? And eventually that complexity grows up and congeals. So that is like the soil, and you can export this metaphor to any level of abstraction. You could export it to society. Like the soil is the stories, it is our history, it is our culture. I think culture has been greatly devalued, and this AI argument is trying to devalue culture even further. Our history, our culture, of all of the different cultures that we've had, that's the soil that we grow in, and we need that to be healthy and fertile, and we need to respect it for the roots to take place and for the core of the species to grow up and pull nourishment for. Yes, of course we have the sun, and we need the sun to beat down on us to give nutrition in life, but people mistakenly place that as God. And I think really what it is that's what the tree grows towards, right? We're trying to get towards that source of nutrition, which is our best possible self, and we're never going to get there, but it's an ideal that we aim for, rather than a God that's sitting up there giving me rules from the top down, which of course people are going to rebel against the religious worldview under that standpoint. But if we see it as an ideal of where we want to get to, where our tree is going to grow to, it's healthier. Another perfect interpretation of this that proves that the top-down hierarchical God up top is a bullshit idea. You can have a sun beating down on a tree that's fallen down. Its roots are no longer in the fertile soil. You got fertile soil, you got a sun, you got a tree with a rotten core that falls over. They're not going to nourish it. So we do need the nourishment from the soil. We do need it from the tree. But that tree has to be planted in the soil for the sun to have any meaning at all. And I think that's the right way to view religion and mythology, is that it's helping us reach towards those ideals. So again, the tree is the perfect metaphor for that. I think the tree is the perfect metaphor for relationships as well. There's a relationship between the sun and the soil, and the tree's in the middle, and the tree is the thing that's growing. And that's something that I learned, and I just revised my opinion on individualism because of the conversations that we've had with Luciano Floridi and the essay that he gave us for issue 5 of The Abolition of Man. At the end of that, well, the whole essay, I don't want to spoil it too much, but he tries to switch ethics from an ethics of what do I need to do to be good to what do I do for that other entity, whether it be a person or your tree, your backyard, your house, what I need to do for that for it to be healthiest. And there's a flaw in that of like, if you're always the caregiver, you're going to expend yourself. So you do need to look out for yourself. And the point there is that really what you're trying to take care of the most is the relationship between the two things. And that totally changed my mind for the last 20 years or so. I would tell you I'm a staunch individualist. Like any whiff of collectivism scares the shit out of me. But I've changed now. It's the collective and the individual need to nourish the relationship. And I think that's, the soil is the collective, and wherever you want to put those, the individuals, the sun, or vice versa, I don't really care. But the tree is the connective tissue between them, and or maybe the branches. I haven't worked that part of the metaphor out yet, but the collective needs to value as much as possible the rights of every individual's wishes, but also you can't legislate that. That's the problem that I've always had with collectivism, is as soon as you start legislating proper behavior, you get totalitarian government. So you have to have a government grounded in the respect of the individual above the collective. But there's a huge responsibility in that for each individual then to act responsibly towards the collective. And because we're an expedient, childish species, we don't tend to do that. And it gets ever harder when more and more people act childish. It's a less and less incentive for an individual to take on the burden of being an adult and not just fall into expedience themselves. And I think we're seeing that in the world right now, is this like, fuck it, get your own attitude. The only answer to not legislating it and turning it into a totalitarian world is every single person has to take on the responsibility for themselves to foster their relationship with the collective. And stories is one of the ways we do that, and we have to value that soil that we're trying to get rooted in. This also applies to institutions. I believe we've just been having some things at work where it's becoming very evident that for a higher education to function right, it has to be grounded in the community, because we can't fix all the problems. Like by the time people get to us at 18 to 20 years old, they've experienced a lot of stuff in life, and we're going to do our best to try and help them. But the college has a greater mission to foster the community and have relationships with the community, because it starts in the local churches or in the home, or like wherever kids are being raised, has to start there. And so seeing it as a relationship between the individuals, the responsibilities of the individuals and the responsibilities of the collective is really important to me. So this metaphor of the tree that Alexis opened up for me the other day, as expansionary growth rather than inversionism or linearity or something like that, coincides perfectly with all of these other lessons I've been learning. And that's why this page in particular, now that I've come back to it, because I just grabbed it because I needed a page for the tree, it gained even more importance to me in the fact that metaphor wasn't unpacked in the book. Obviously the snake metaphor, he's going with the standard interpretation that I think should be reinterpreted in a more useful way. But the image here of this kid with this book of all of the knowledge, but he's like blind to the tree behind him. I think that's the ultimate message of the book, is don't be blind to the tree. Maybe that is intentional on Brian McDonald's part. Maybe he understands that for people to really learn a lesson, they have to go through it themselves. Like even me sitting here explaining it to you probably won't land as much impact as me sitting there having the revelation for myself. So maybe that's what he's suggesting here. So maybe it's not a failure of the book, I don't know. But it just wasn't covered in the book. And I think this image here he says, this book is your journey through the underworld to find the wisdom kept there from the storytellers to learn from. It is a gift from you to you from the land of the dead. And I don't know if, I mean, he seems to be tying that to the tree, so I don't know, but it's not covered in the book. But obviously this viewpoint that just occurred to me is means a lot to me, and so I had to share it with people. So I really appreciate, I know this is way longer than a normal one-man review. Hopefully it has been worth it for you all. And I just also want to thank, and again, try and say, I don't want this to come across as like I had a revelation that's going to change the world. This is a gift that was given to me through this book and through all the conversations we've had with everyone on the channel, and that includes all the comments of the viewers. That kind of collective force of the stories of everyone and the comments of everyone allowed me as an individual to have a revelation that was personally meaningful enough to me that I want to share it, and then hopefully that's also helpful for you all. And if it is, that's awesome. Please share it. I hope it impacts people. If it's not, then I want to hear why you think I'm wrong, because I want to be Socrates in reverse. I want to continue refining myself. That, to me, is what this channel is all about, is engaging with people and hearing ideas and seeing what other storytellers are doing, seeing what stories are out there, trying to get a pulse of the zeitgeist and see if the zeitgeist is moving in a healthy direction or not, and try and use positive conversation to shift it into a healthier place. Because this is about creators, right? This channel started with that in mind, and I think continues to be about that. So this is like a thank you to you all, and a big thank you to Brian McDonald, a huge thank you. I mean, the biggest thank you to Alexis and Luciano as the two people that really, really cracked open my understanding in the last couple of months. And then this book for kind of giving me the slate, not the blank slate, but a slate that had some stuff on it, had some information, and it gave me a chance to see things. And I hope you all go out and buy it. The Land of the Dead, Lessons from the Underworld on Storytelling and Living by Brian McDonald and Toby Cypress. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you all so much for all of it, because I wouldn't be having this conversation without you all.
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.